Hello, I'm Dr. Anil Guri. I'm a consultant in reproductive medicine, surgery and assisted conception at the Homerton Fertility Centre in London. For the past 2 weeks, I have tried to look at clinical queries rather than reviewing journals. We'll go back to reviewing journals from next week. There are a few complex cases sent by colleagues from across the world, and this one was sent from Malaysia. An extremely interesting case which is equally challenging, especially in cases of PCOS. How often do we find that our stimulation goes right, or we think our stimulation is planned right, and what turns out to be or should be an ovarian stimulation where you want multiple follicles turns out to be an ovulation induction in PCO where you get 3 or 4 follicles, compromising the entire cycle and leading to lower results. PCOS will always be a challenge, and whether or not we can address it will depend on how much we understand. Now let's look at this. A case was sent with failure to get eggs with a woman with a high AMH. So let's look at the case. A 33-year-old, polycystic ovarian syndrome, an AMH of 95.25 p-mol/liter, a massive rise of AMH, pre-treatment given by the oral contraceptive pill with 2 aims. One is scheduling, and the other is to synchronize follicles. An FSH of 4.21 and the LH of 1.97. Believe irregular cycles, more than 20 follicles in each ovary, many of them very small, and the stimulation was started with 300 of menopur. And what is menopur? It is FSH, HMG with about 8 to 10 units of HCG. And that's important to realize because it has a slightly more prolonged LH activity. And again, should we give LH or HMG to PCOS? The answer is yes. Take that concept out of your head that you require Gonal-F or Piragon or recombinant FSH to stimulate PCOS. It's a concept which is very old, highly corrupted by the pharma companies who have convinced doctors that for PCOS you have to use FSH. And in my lectures, which will be there online and in the course, I'll convince you that FSH in fact reduces the chances of pregnancy in a fresh cycle in PCOS unless you're planning to freeze all. Let's look at the folliculogram. Very interesting folliculogram. Menopur started with 300. By day 5, there is no recruitment. Multiple small follicles, less than 5 millimeter, but no recruitment at all. The first recruitment starts around day 8, where you see follicles still less than 10 millimeter. Get to day 10, and you've seen the first recruitment. And what does it show you? It shows you the first sign that a recruitment for ovarian stimulation is failing. It shows you that you have been able to recruit about 4 or 5 follicles from a follicle base that is much larger. Go back to day 13 and you have about 5 follicles growing. This with lots and lots of small follicles. And what did it tell you? It tells you again that the smaller follicles have not been recruited. By day 15, follicles have reached 18 to 20, 5 follicles, HCG trigger is given with an E2 of 2822, and unfortunately, no eggs are obtained. There are 2 points to it. Let's go first to the stimulation and next to the trigger. Now, this is a case of PCOS. Cycles, I believe, are regular. Let's have a look at the LH again. Here, the LH is not very high. And I am generally a bit worried. I tend to worry when I don't get an LH that crosses 2. The reason is, even though you see a large number of women who do not have high LH, because LH is up only in 40% of PCOS and not all of PCOS, thus it is not the best marker of detecting PCOS. You start realizing that that LH marker tells you 2 things. It tells you more about the theca component. It tells you how the pituitary response is going to occur. And it also tells you whether you can manipulate the pituitary by using an analog trigger. So in this case, the question we get is, what do we do? Have we been able to break the threshold of the follicles here? For a successful stimulation, it is essential that you break the threshold of multiple follicles, not one or two. Now, I would always insist that you draw the follicles. The reason is, as humans, diagrams and pictures have a better impact on our brains and understanding than written material. It also gives us an understanding of what we're dealing with. Let's look at picture 1. Picture 1 shows a large ovary with multiple small follicles, less than 4 millimeter, high AMH. Number 2, reasonably high AMH, follicles which are bigger, range between 2 and 8 millimeter. And number 3 is follicles at about 7 to 8 millimeter, or between 5 and 8 millimeter, with no theca component. And the first thing that comes into mind is, which of these ovaries are you looking at? Are you looking at an ovary that has dense theca with very small antral follicles? Or are you looking at an ovary which is PCO-like with larger follicles? Both react very differently. I don't know how many of you all are coming to Dubai to the 4-day course that I run with my colleagues in November. But there we will talk about how to differentiate these ovaries, target these ovaries essentially with a different protocol, and also those in which you do not see theca cells, where you go back to the drawing board and try and find out whether we are missing something. Now, what I believe in this case, from the information I've been given, is that the ovary is like type 1, where it is PCOS, but my question would be here is, why is the LH still low? Have we got it at a completely wrong time where she was ovulatory? And I would suggest the first thing to do is to repeat her entire hormonal profile. Now, jokingly, I call this triangle the goody triangle. And the reason is two things. It gets you to explain things much better. And secondly, I doubt if anyone would not give a smile when you call something with such a nice name like goody. That's a joke on the other hand. But have a look at this triangle. Now, the aim of the ovary is to produce an egg. The middle section is what you see on a scan, and the lower part is what, to a certain extent, not entirely, is represented by AMH. Now, if you see follicles closer to the threshold, closer to the 8 or 10 millimeter mark, these follicles will always get recruited first. And with the more follicles you have there, your stimulation will get better. See number 2, follicles which are lower down at 2 or 3 millimeter mark are incredibly difficult to stimulate. Why again? Because these ovaries are under phenomenal insulin resistance, where folliculogenesis itself is arrested. These ovaries are more difficult to stimulate because you cannot push the ovaries hard with FSH, and these ovaries take longer to recruit. I call them the bad PCOS. There's no such classification, but these ovaries should give you an idea that your stimulation is going to go bad. There's a higher proportion of immature eggs, and probably these ovaries need some treatment later on. And from the information given by my colleague from Malaysia, I think this is the ovary he was handling, and you can see the impact. Next, we come to trigger. Our dependence on HCG as a trigger has to start decreasing. The reason is, it is not a physiological trigger. It does not give you the rise of FSH, which in some cases is essential. But yes, if you want to do a fresh transfer, a cycle without HCG will give you lower results. So what would I suggest in this case? Another repeat of the hormonal profile. Have a look at what is the rise of LH and what is the rise of FSH. What is the estrogen rise? Also, do it without a withdrawal bleeding. If it's an irregular cycle, wait for a cycle to come and then see what is happening. Could it be a case of hypo-hypog? start thinking more and more. You have to realize that in modern times, women are different to what they were about 15 or 20 years ago. Women tend to lose more weight. They tend to be affected by what happens on social media. And you see girls at between 20 and 25 where weight is much less, sometimes offsetting the hypothalamic pituitary axis. So you still have PCOS with the pituitary being shut down, which is very more and more commonly seen in modern times. And that makes these treatments incredibly difficult. Next is the role of supplements. Enofolic is, again, a very challenging new subject. Does it work? I don't know. But I would suggest there's no harm giving her 2 to 3 months of Enofolic. These are the cases of irregular cycles, of PCOS, who will benefit from metformin. Metformin reduces insulin resistance. Let's forget quality of eggs. It reduces insulin resistance, allows for more ATP to be given to cells. These cells desperately need more energy. The next thing is change the stimulation. And there are cases, I have been able to stimulate some of these women on a much higher dose. And I would suggest to move between 450 at this stage, divide it into a morning and evening dose or a more aggressive dose with metformin and seeing what happens till day 5. If you can recruit between 10 to 12 follicles by day 10, I think then we are on a much better platform to get a better cohort of follicles. Regarding the trigger, I am getting more and more convinced that the analog trigger is a more physiological trigger. And I tend to give a much higher dose of analog, I use biserolin, moving from giving a 5 times higher dose from 0.5 milligram to 2.5 milligram, and sometimes repeating it the next day. But that's a discussion later. It is important to realize how your pituitary responds to the trigger. And in these cases, it is equally important to realize that your trigger works if 3 components tend to work very well. The pituitary increases its FSH, the pituitary increases its LH, and the ovarian progesterone starts increasing before ovulation. Something which give me a year and we will demonstrate in one of the largest analog studies that we'll be doing in our center. This is in short what we have discussed about this case. Once again, I would request you share this page. It is important that we spread knowledge. Knowledge cannot be held within doors, and I see that a lot of knowledge is held within doors and not spread. And send me more questions. This question was constructed well. It was complete. I did not have to go to and fro asking for more queries. But also it allows us to enjoy reproductive medicine. And again, if you want to meet us and have this 4-day course, we'll be doing that in Dubai, middle of Dubai. And you're more than welcome to join us. Thank you very much.